All right, so we're going to dive into a story today. It's a story that's more than just headlines, you know. It's about the Crips and Bloods. And we've got this fascinating document, the Watts Gang Treaty from 1992. It's really something. It makes you think that even in the toughest spots, peace is possible. Who would have thought?
Yeah, it's more than just gangs, though. This document, this treaty, it's a window into a whole community battling poverty, racism, and this feeling of just being completely abandoned by the system. It helps us understand what sparked this rivalry in the first place.
Okay, so the Crips, they formed in 71. And from what I understand, they were really focused on protecting their own neighborhoods. They wanted safety, they wanted belonging, and to push back against all the violence they saw around them. And then a couple years later, the Bloods emerged in 72. And get this, they actually share the same core value, protection. But this is all happening in Watts. During the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a community that had already been hit hard by the Watts riots and was facing constant social and economic roadblocks.
Right. And, public housing projects at the time, they were meant to provide shelter. But they ended up kind of concentrating poverty and almost accidentally became a breeding ground for gang culture. It's like they became these mini versions of the larger societal issues that were happening everywhere.
Wow, that's almost poetic, isn't it? You create these spaces to try and help people, but without actually addressing the real issues: economic opportunity, social support, racial inequality. They almost end up creating the exact problems they were trying to solve.
Exactly. And then you add in these aggressive policing tactics from the LAPD, things like Operation Hammer, which were supposed to stop crime, but actually just pushed the community further away and made them even more distrustful of the police.
It's like adding fuel to a fire.
Yeah.
You have all this social and economic tension, and then boom, crack cocaine explodes in the 80s, and gang violence just goes through the roof, turning into turf wars, fights over drug money, and this seemingly endless cycle of revenge. Reading about families being torn apart, communities living in fear. It's just heartbreaking.
But even in the middle of all that chaos, there were people who had been in gangs themselves, who were just desperate for change. People like Dodd and Akela Sherrills. They saw the devastation firsthand, and they wanted to stop it.
And this is where the Watts Gang Treaty comes in, right? These activists step up to try and bring peace. It's a true grassroots movement, coming from those who had actually lived the life they were now trying to change.
And they were really smart about it, too. They didn't just hope for the best. They actually, get this, they studied the 1949 Egypt-Israel Armistice Agreement. And they used it as a model. They understood that peace needed more than just a ceasefire. It needed a way to resolve conflicts, to rebuild trust, and a shared vision for the future.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah.
They went all the way back to the Egypt-Israel agreement. That's wild. But it makes sense. Lasting peace needs to be built on something solid, not just good vibes and wishful thinking.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that 1949 agreement really focused on things like demilitarized zones and civilian oversight. Concepts that, amazingly, the treaty creators adapted to the gang situation. That's really outside-the-box thinking.
Okay, so the treaty itself calls for a ceasefire. It tries to get armed gang members off the streets. It even outlines ways to help the community grow and heal. And then it goes even further. It talks about taking back the colors, red, blue, and purple, and making them symbols of unity instead of division.
It's powerful stuff, It shows that they really wanted to change the whole narrative, to move past this rivalry and create a shared future.
And you know what? For a while, it actually worked. Gang violence dropped significantly after the treaty was signed, especially in Watts. It even inspired other cities to try and do similar things. But, of course, lasting peace is fragile, right? Especially when it's built on deep-rooted social and economic problems that haven't really been fixed.
You're absolutely right. The treaty faced some big roadblocks. The police didn't really trust it. They saw it as gangs getting stronger, not actual peace. Then there was a lack of economic investment. And of course, all the trauma from the past was still very fresh in everyone's minds.
Okay, but wait a minute. The treaty called for some pretty big changes, like investing in housing, education, job training, revitalizing the community. Did that not attract any investment at all?
Unfortunately, not enough to create lasting change. And some people even argue that the treaty kind of backfired in that way. Some investors were actually afraid to put money into a community where gangs were seen as being formally empowered by a treaty. It's complicated,
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's almost like the treaty tried to fix things, but it might have accidentally made some things harder.
Right. It's a real irony. This effort to bring peace might have scared off the resources that were actually needed to make it last.
That's heavy stuff. So what happened next?
Well, then we have the Rodney King verdict, which really just added fuel to the fire. The The riots that happened in '92 were devastating, but they also seemed to make some gang members even more determined to find peace. It was this strange mix of hope and despair. They saw that violence only creates more violence, but they were also incredibly frustrated that nothing was really changing in the system, you know? All this brings up something really interesting, something that the documents we've looked at, including the treaty itself, point to, and it's the role of religion and spirituality. They actually played a big part in creating peace during this time. It wasn't just about practical solutions, it was about something much deeper, like a search for forgiveness and understanding, especially for a community that had been through so much.
Hold on, really?
Mm-hmm.
You're saying that in the middle of all this gang stuff,
Mm-hmm.
faith was a driving force for change. I never would guess that.
Absolutely. A lot of the activists who helped create the treaty were deeply religious, and their beliefs really shaped their dedication to nonviolence and social justice.
Okay, that's pretty fascinating. It really makes you think about how faith, in all its different forms, can be this incredible source of resilience and give people the strength to try and change things.
It's true. They were drawing inspiration from religious texts, they were holding meetings in mosques, and really finding comfort and strength in their shared spirituality.
So it wasn't just a Watts thing. Did this spread to other places too?
Oh, totally. The treaty's influence reached way beyond just Watts. You see similar peace efforts popping up in other cities, Compton, Long Beach, Pasadena. These communities were all facing their own struggles, and they saw the Watts Treaty as this model, a sign that maybe, just maybe, things could be different.
That's pretty amazing. It's like this ripple effect, One act of courage inspires another, and suddenly this whole movement for peace is spreading.
Exactly. There was this real sense of connection that emerges from all these sources. People were sharing strategies, they were organizing conferences, and realizing that fighting for peace meant working together across communities. It wasn't about just isolating one neighborhood or one gang. It was about a problem that was affecting everybody.
So within all these peace efforts, was there anyone who really stood out?
Well, there's one figure who's both fascinating and, well, kind of unexpected. Stanley Tookie Williams, one of the co-founders of the Crips. Initially, he was skeptical of the treaty, but while he was on death row, he went through this incredible personal transformation and became a huge advocate for peace.
Wait, are you serious?
Yeah.
The guy who helped start one of the most notorious gangs in America ends up speaking out against violence and urging young people to choose a different path. That's quite the twat twist.
Yeah. Right. His story is really tragic, but it's also incredibly inspiring. It shows the power of redemption, how someone who was so deeply involved in a culture of violence could find a way to peace and forgiveness, even from behind bars. Williams became this powerful symbol of hope. He was challenging the very system that he was once a part of.
His story really makes you believe that change is possible, no matter where you come from or what you've done.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Williams wasn't alone. There were a lot of former gang members who became mediators, mentors, community leaders. They used their own experiences to try and guide others towards a more peaceful life. They were living proof that the treaty's vision could work, even if it was really hard to achieve.
Their experience must have been so valuable they could connect with young people in a way that most people just couldn't.
Exactly. Their credibility was key. These were people who understood the language of the streets, the complexities of gang life. They could relate to these young people in a way that no one else really could. They were the bridge builders, the trust makers, the essential foundation of this very fragile peace.
It's really inspiring to hear about their dedication to creating change. But we talked earlier about how the treaty faced some serious challenges. What were some of the biggest obstacles they encountered?
Well, one of the biggest, and this might surprise you, came from law enforcement. A lot of police officers just didn't trust the treaty. They saw it as a way for gangs to consolidate their power, not a genuine attempt to reduce violence.
Wait, seriously, that's so ironic. The people who are supposed to be protecting the community end up being a roadblock to peace.
I know, right? And of course, they had some legitimate concerns. Some people worried that the treaty would just shift to violence, from between gangs to attacks on the police. Or other communities, would it create this more organized and dangerous criminal network? These were valid questions, but unfortunately, they just made the distrust between law enforcement and those who were actually working for peace even worse.
It's a real missed opportunity, isn't it? Instead of working with these community leaders and supporting the treaty, they just kind of doubled down on the tough tactics, which probably just pushed people further away.
You're right. It's a classic example of how good intentions, without really understanding the situation, can have some pretty bad unintended consequences. This whole tough on crime approach was popular at the time, but it often ignored the social and economic problems that were actually contributing to the violence.
And that creates this vicious cycle, doesn't it? You crack down on communities, you lose their trust, you fuel resentment, and you end up creating the very violence you were trying to stop. It's so frustrating.
Exactly. Then you add in the whole issue of economic investment, or rather, the lack of it. The treaty itself recognized that lasting peace needed more than just stopping the fighting. It needed to give people opportunities, to rebuild their lives, to find jobs, to escape the poverty that kept them trapped.
We talked about this before, but it's worth repeating. The treaty had some pretty bold ideas for economic development, investing in housing, education, job training, revitalizing the community. It recognized that peace needs the right conditions to flourish.
You're right, and this is where the treaty's legacy becomes really complicated. Even though it was successful at first in reducing violence, it just couldn't overcome the really deep economic and social inequalities that were plaguing these communities. The investments that were promised never materialized. And a lot of people felt like the treaty had become a symbol of broken promises and dashed hopes.
That's really heartbreaking, this surge of hope, this belief that they could build a better future. It just faded away, and the violence came back.
It's a hard lesson. Peace isn't a finish line. It's an ongoing journey that demands constant effort, commitment, and a willingness to really address the root causes of conflict.
So where does this leave us? What can we learn from the Watts Gang Treaty, both the good and the bad? How can it help us build a more peaceful world today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because, let's be real, those challenges those communities faced, poverty, inequality, systemic racism, lack of opportunity, they're not limited to South Central LA. These are issues that we see all over the world. You know, it feels like we've been on this incredible journey, hasn't it? From this really intense rivalry to this moment of hope with the treaty, and then this harsh reality that just kind of sets in.
Yeah. It's been heavy, but also eye-opening. What really gets me from all these different sources is that this whole story is about way more than just gangs fighting. It's like it holds up this mirror to all the problems that society is dealing with.
You're absolutely right. When we zoom out and look at the big picture, the Watts Gang Treaty becomes this little tiny example of this fight for peace and justice in a world that's full of inequality. It's this stark reminder that you can't just fix the violence. You got to get to the root of what's causing it.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, couldn't we use these same efforts, these acts of bravery and reconciliation to deal with other conflicts, other divisions in the world today? What would it take to build lasting peace? Not just a truce, but a real change in how people think and feel about each other.
That's a deep question, and one that I don't think has an easy answer. But what I find so inspiring about the Watts Gang Treaty is that it shows us what's possible when people refuse to just accept things the way they are, when they dare to imagine something different and are willing to risk everything to make it happen.
It reminds us that peace isn't just something someone hands you. It's built by people, by communities. And often, the most unexpected heroes.
Exactly. It challenges us to look at our own communities, our own lives even, and ask ourselves, where are the chances for us to connect with people who are different from us? How can we heal old wounds? How can we address the things that are causing conflict in the first place? What are the little small acts of courage that we can take to create a fairer and more peaceful world? One conversation, one relationship, one act of kindness at a time.
Those are some really powerful questions. So for those of you listening who are interested in diving deeper, I encourage you to explore the Watts Gang Treaty itself and all the amazing stories that surround it.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can emerge, and real change is always possible.
That's right. And speaking of hope and change, we here at All Sorts Podcast are here to guide you through all the twists and turns of history, culture, and the human experience.
Just like the Watts Gang Treaty tried to weave together this tapestry of peace. From all these threads of rivalry, we aim to stitch together a rich fabric of knowledge and understanding from all these diverse threads of human experience.
If this deep dive has resonated with you, and you're hungry for more thought-provoking conversations like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel, where these stories really come alive.
And don't forget to follow us on X, Instagram, and Threads. Think of them as your portals to a world of ideas and conversations that will leave you feeling inspired and informed.
So go out there and make a difference. The world needs your voice, your compassion, and your commitment to a better future.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking knowledge.
This is All Sorts Podcast, signing off. We'll catch you in the next deep dive.